No one had used the lighthouse in years. Not officially. Not in the way it was once needed when fishing boats clung to its beam like a lifeline, and freighters passed by close enough to make the windows rattle. That time had gone quietly the way most things did around here. But every evening, Edgar Martinez still climbed the 72 steps to the top. He lit the beacon like he had always done, first with care, then with habit, and eventually with a kind of quiet defiance. No ship needed it anymore, but that wasn't the point. He told no one. He had no one to tell. The sea below had grown quieter too. More driftwood than boats, more gulls than horns. But Edgar remained alone in the weathered building where salt had worn the paint from the walls and the hinges groaned like old men stretching. His days were slow. A rhythm of maintenance, radio silence, and canned soup. He listened to the local AM station in the mornings and weather reports in the evenings. Once a month, Dr. Toma brought his medications and a bag of groceries. The two exchanged words like currency carefully, rarely. Edgar didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he'd come to need it. It gave shape to his days. It made forgetting easier. His bedroom was small, barely furnished. The only framed photo on the wall had the faces turned inward, tucked behind the glass. He never looked at it anymore. He didn't need to. He remembered every detail. The light was his purpose, even if no one was watching. On this particular morning, fog draped the coastline like a thick quilt. He stood on the porch with his coffee black, lukewarm, always from the same chipped tin pot, and listened to the waves breathe in and out against the rocks. The lighthouse behind him loomed tall, casting no shadow in the dull gray. He didn't check his phone, didn't own one. The only time he made a call was on the landline in the keeper's office, when the weather got violent or the batteries failed. He walked the property once a day, boots heavy against the sand and salt-stiff grass, picked up driftwood, hammered a loose shutter, swept sand from the steps. The routine was unremarkable. That was why it worked. But today, something was off. Just past the side shed near the utility hatch, Edgar stopped. A faint trail of flattened grass curved away from the cliff path and toward the maintenance door. He narrowed his eyes, squatted down. A boot print, small, too small to be his. He frowned. Could be a hiker, he thought. The coastal trail sometimes pulled in the reckless and lost, but hikers usually left trash or shouted or knocked. There'd been no sound, no knock, just quiet. Back inside, Edgar opened the logbook and made a note. Footprints near lower hatch. No sign of forced entry, no damage, watch for return. He capped the pen slowly, glanced out the window, fog still thick. The shed stood where it always did, slouched against the wind, door closed, nothing visible. He lit the stove and set a pot of water on, same as every morning. But as he reached for the tea tin, he paused. The mug sitting in the drying rack wasn't his. He only used the blue enamel one. This one was white, cracked at the lip, too clean to be dusty, too wet to have sat long. Edgar stood still, water beginning to boil behind him. For the first time in months, he locked the front door. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. He didn't like questions. Questions led to remembering. And remembering was dangerous. As the light blinked faintly from the tower above, Edgar sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around his cup, staring at the mug that didn't belong. The sea continued, unconcerned. The fog didn't lift. Somewhere outside, a second pair of eyes watched the tower blink. The wind had shifted. That was the first thing Edgar noticed when he stepped outside that afternoon. The breeze came from the north now, colder, bringing the smell of damp rope and something faintly metallic. He adjusted his cap, tugged his jacket tighter, and began his usual loop around the property. It was habit. He didn't question it anymore. Just one foot in front of the other around the lighthouse base, past the edge of the tool shed, then down to the lower path near the cliff. Today something stopped him near the gravel slope behind the generator building. Footprints, not his, lighter, narrower, pressed into the wet sand where the gravel thinned out. He crouched without thinking, his knees groaning in protest. The prints were faint but fresh, a single pair. Leading away from the cliffside and toward the auxiliary entrance beneath the tower, an old hatch that hadn't been opened in years. Edgar followed the trail slowly. The fog still hung low, thick enough to blur the rocks but thin enough to see motion. He moved with practiced quiet. One hand brushed the wall of the lighthouse as he descended the slope, fingertips tracing moss-covered stone like braille. Then, near the hatch, something caught the corner of his eye. Bright yellow, folded, damp. He bent to retrieve it, a child's rain poncho, the kind with cartoon whales and oversized buttons. Too small for a teenager, too neat to have been discarded by accident. He held it by the collar, water dripping from its hem. Edgar didn't move for a long while. The poncho dangled from his fingers like a question no one had asked. Then he turned slowly, eyes scanning the area. The hatch was still locked. He checked it, tugged gently at the rusted handle. No signs of damage, no scratches. But something about it felt off, like the air had shifted inside. Or maybe it was just the weight of something returning to memory. He made a second note in the logbook that evening. Child's poncho found, hatch secure, unknown presence likely, monitor grounds. It wasn't paranoia, it was precision. He had spent too many years depending on small signs, a cracked valve, a subtle vibration in the tower, a dip in voltage. You didn't wait for disaster to knock. You caught it before it took shape. But this wasn't mechanical. It wasn't structural. This was something else. He didn't sleep well that night. Not for fear, for disquiet. At 2:11 a.m., he got out of bed and checked the front lock again. Still bolted. At 3:37, he stood at the kitchen window, staring at the shed. A faint shape moved past it, or maybe it was just a shadow and a trick of fog. Either way, he didn't open the door. By dawn, nothing had changed, except the mug. The white mug he'd noticed earlier, the one that wasn't his, was gone from the drying rack. In its place sat a different one, blue with chipped edges. It matched his usual, almost exactly, but Edgar knew, the way a man knows the curve of his own hand, or the sound of his own step on a wooden stair. This mug wasn't his. Someone was here, not loudly, not messily, but present and intentional. He boiled water anyway. Filled the mug, set it down in front of the second chair across the table. Let it sit there, steaming. He didn't speak to it. He just waited. The rain came harder after midnight. It wasn't the usual coastal drizzle, but a full-bodied storm wind pushing sideways, sea spray turning to mist slapping against the windows in short, hard bursts. Edgar had checked the forecasts. He always did. Still, the intensity caught him off guard. The tower moaned once, low and long, the way it only did when the gusts came from the west. Edgar pulled on his boots, grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door, and stepped into the wind. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. Routine had taught him that weather like this revealed what people normally hid: loose shutters, warped doors, buried weaknesses, or something else entirely. His coat snapped against his legs as he circled the lighthouse. The fog was thinner than usual, but the dark hung dense. His beam of light bounced across rocks and old driftwood, tracing the familiar edges of the station. Everything looked as it always did until he passed the old generator room. The door was cracked. Not open, not broken, just not closed. It should have been. He stepped closer, boots crunching over gravel, then paused. Listened. Inside, nothing moved. He pushed the door slowly. Hinges groaned sharp, then silent. The room beyond was damp and cold, a square of concrete half submerged under old cables and rusted fittings. No lights. No electricity here anymore. But in the corner, beneath a draped tarp and behind two stacked crates, was something that didn't belong. A shape. No three. The flashlight found them gently. A woman curled on her side, arms wrapped around two small children. A blanket frayed and faded was stretched over them unevenly. The woman's hair was soaked, stuck to her cheek. One child had their thumb in their mouth. The other held a small toy, something handmade, a fish stitched from denim and buttons. They didn't wake. Edgar stood in the doorway, holding his breath. There was no sign of force, no mess, no danger, just exhaustion, just stillness. He took a step back, then another, and closed the door quietly, firmly. Back in the main house, he lit the stove and boiled water. He didn't think, didn't weigh anything, just moved the way you move when you've done something many times, even if you don't remember why. He poured the last of the soup into a pot, heated it until steam kissed his face, pulled out 3 bowls, found a clean blanket in the storage chest, his daughter's maybe, the one with the faded pattern of birds stitched around the border. He didn't let himself look at it too long. When he returned, he didn't knock. He just entered, set down the tray, and left. 15 minutes passed, then 20. He didn't check again until morning. The rain had stopped. A pale sun nudged through the clouds. Edgar opened the door to the generator room and found the bowls scraped clean. The blanket folded, resting on top of the crates. The children were still asleep, but the woman was sitting up. Her eyes were wide but not afraid. Her back was straight but not rigid. She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "We didn't mean to stay." Edgar nodded once. She hesitated. "The storm. We thought this place was empty. We just needed one night." He didn't answer, didn't ask names, didn't demand explanations. He only looked at the tarp, then at her, then turned and left again, boots thudding slowly on the concrete. He didn't lock the door behind him. He couldn't say why, but something in that room, the way the girls had huddled against their mother, the way the toy fish's thread was coming loose at the seams, reminded him of something buried. Not the past, not directly, just the shape of it. The way grief left behind echoes that sometimes sounded like shelter. And for now, he thought, shelter was enough. The sun broke through just enough to cast a faint line of gold across the horizon. Not warmth, just light. Edgar stood on the porch with his coffee and watched it without blinking. He hadn't returned to the generator room. Not yet. Some things were better left alone, at least for a little while. He placed the mug down, walked inside, and opened the pantry. He didn't have much. A loaf of rye bread gone slightly stiff, a tin of sardines, 3 apples, 1 bruised. He set them all on the counter without thinking, poured water into a canteen, refilled the thermos with tea. Then he wrapped everything in a clean towel and walked back to the shed. No one met him at the door. No one needed to. He placed the bundle gently on a low shelf inside the room. Didn't linger, didn't say a word. The woman wasn't there. The children were asleep still, curled together like twin commas in a sentence left unfinished. As he turned to leave, he saw it tucked beside one of the crates. The blue mug, the one he thought was his. Only now he wasn't so sure. This one had a chip in a different place. Had it always? He took it with him. Back in the house, Edgar sat at the table and stared at the 2 mugs, his and not his. They were almost identical, but one had scratches in the glaze like tiny cracks under the surface. He set both aside and scrubbed them clean, just in case. Later that morning, he heard movement, a soft creak on the stairs outside the generator room. He didn't look up from his workbench. He was carving a piece of driftwood, shaping it into something that might become a handle or a hook. It didn't matter. He didn't want to startle them, didn't want to force anything. Instead, he made a new pot of soup. Root vegetables, barley, a pinch of thyme. The smell filled the space slowly, climbing into the rafters, softening the walls. Around noon, he stepped outside. There they were, the woman and the 2 girls standing a few feet from the shed. One of the girls, the one with darker hair, held the toy fish in one hand and a torn backpack in the other. The other child clung to her mother's leg. The woman looked unsure, ready to retreat. Edgar nodded once, then motioned gently toward the porch table. 3 bowls already waited. He didn't wait for them to respond, just walked back inside and left the door open. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then the door creaked open behind him. The sound of spoons on ceramic. A quiet thank you mumbled low. Nothing more. They ate in silence. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer his name. When the smaller girl sneezed, he handed her a folded handkerchief without comment. She took it and blinked up at him, unsure if it was allowed. He nodded once. That was enough. After lunch, they returned to the shed. By dusk, the food had been cleared, the dishes washed, placed on the step like a kind of offering. That night, Edgar lit the beacon as always. The lens rotated smoothly. The light reached into the dark, casting slow arcs across the restless sea. No ships out there, no signals, just the quiet hum of routine. He sat in the tower's chair and looked out at the fog. They hadn't spoken more than 5 words between them. But something had shifted. It wasn't welcome. It wasn't invitation. But it wasn't refusal either. It was something in between, a space where nothing had been before. And that, he thought, was more than enough. By the 3rd day, the wind had calmed. The sea flattened out just enough for the gulls to sit on it like stones. Edgar, standing near the front railing, felt the shift not in the sky but in the rhythm of the place. The silence had changed. It no longer echoed. It simply filled. Inside, the house smelled faintly of boiled root vegetables and soap someone had cleaned. Not deep, but enough to notice. The rug near the back door had been shaken out. The window in the pantry, long jammed shut, now opened with a faint creak. And the chair at the workbench, the one with the cracked spindle, had been repaired. He didn't ask, didn't comment. But that morning, when he passed the shed, Marla was outside, oiling the hinges of the old vent flap with an instinctive hand. She didn't greet him. She simply said, "It sticks when it rains," then returned to her work. He watched for a moment. Her movements were efficient, practical. She wiped the excess oil with the hem of her jacket, tested the swing of the flap, then packed the wrench back into a canvas roll clearly her own. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. First real question he'd offered. She paused as if surprised. "Machinist, 18 years. Factory shut down last fall." He nodded as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Back inside, the girls had rearranged the front sitting area, not deliberately, not to decorate, just in the way children repurpose space. The throw pillows were now forts. A stack of coasters had become currency in some made-up game. The older one, Leah, he'd overheard, was drawing something with chalk on the back of an old map. The younger, Lonnie, hummed tunelessly while tying string to a broken radio knob. He didn't stop them, didn't correct them. But when he sat in his usual chair that night, he noticed it had been dusted, carefully, even the corners. Later in the tower, he found a row of small white seashells lined up along the outer railing, varnished, glued flat, delicate but precise, a pattern that made no sense until it did. He looked out at the fog, then down at the courtyard, and saw one of the girls skipping between stones in the grass, counting under her breath. He didn't wave, but when he returned to the kitchen, he found a tiny shell taped to the cupboard above the sink. The same kind, a quiet signature. He left it there. That evening, he brought out the box of tools he rarely opened: old sanding blocks, a dull handsaw, a spool of fishing line. Set it by the door without a word. By morning, the door hinge stopped squeaking. The girls never asked to stay longer. Marla never offered a timeline. But by the end of that 3rd day, the house felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, just less hollow. Edgar walked through the room slowly, noticing the absence of dust, the rearranged shoes near the mat, the single sock draped on the heater. He could have been annoyed. Once maybe he would have been. Now he wasn't sure what he felt, only that it wasn't resistance, only that for the first time in a very long while the lighthouse felt like it was being lived in, not just maintained. And that unsettled him, but he didn't stop it. He just kept the shell in the cupboard and poured 4 bowls instead of 1. The table wasn't meant for 4. It was small, square, worn smooth by years of elbows and late-night maps. Edgar had sanded it down a dozen times over the years, out of habit more than care. Tonight it held 4 bowls, 4 spoons, a pot of soup still steaming faintly at the center. No one had been invited, no one asked permission. But as the sun dipped behind the fog, one by one they came in. Lonnie entered first, bare feet soft against the wood floor, holding the toy fish by its tail. She slid into the chair nearest the window and stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently as if counting. Leah followed, carrying 2 mismatched napkins in both hands, carefully laying one at her sister's place, the other at an empty chair. Then Marla. She paused in the doorway, glanced toward Edgar, then down at the table. Her hair was damp, darker than before. She didn't speak, just sat. There was no conversation, no introductions, no apologies, no "how was your day" or "do you need more salt?" Edgar filled the bowls in silence, handed one to each child, one to Marla, then sat with his own. The soup was simple: barley, carrots, potatoes, bits of smoked fish from an old tin. Nothing fancy, nothing worth remembering. But they ate like people who hadn't tasted warmth in weeks. Lonnie slurped noisily until Marla shot her a quiet look. Leah balanced her spoon like a scale before each bite. Edgar, out of long habit, chewed slowly, eyes half lowered, listening to the subtle rhythms. The scrape of spoon on ceramic, the occasional cough, the clink of a bowl being shifted just slightly closer to the pot. About halfway through the meal, Lonnie reached toward the center. Her arm couldn't quite reach the ladle. Edgar, without looking up, passed it to her. She nodded once, solemn, as if it were a transaction of deep importance. She filled her bowl carefully, then leaned over to whisper something in her sister's ear. Leah giggled but quickly covered her mouth. Marla didn't stop them. But Edgar noticed the way her shoulders dropped. Just a little something between relief and exhaustion. The kind that only surfaced when you knew. For at least one meal you didn't have to explain yourself. He didn't ask where they came from. Didn't ask why. She didn't offer. But after the soup, Marla stood and began collecting the bowls. Edgar started to object, an instinct more than anything, but stopped himself. She rinsed them quickly at the sink, dried them with a dish towel she must have pulled from her pack. Leah stacked the spoons with surprising precision. Lonnie wandered to the bookshelf and traced the spines with a finger, stopping at an old almanac full of tide charts. No one asked what would happen tomorrow. No one used the word "stay." When the dishes were done, Marla looked at Edgar, not with expectation, just looking. He met her gaze, and in that quiet stretch between 2 people who had lost enough, something passed. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of threat, a neutral ground made of steam and soup and shared silence. Later that night, after the girls had gone back to the shed and Marla had followed behind them with slow, tired steps, Edgar remained in the kitchen. He cleaned the table with a damp cloth, wiped the stove, turned off the lantern, then paused. At the center of the table, someone had left a shell, small, white, smooth. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up, turned it over in his palm. On the underside, written in shaky, childlike pencil, "Thank you for not asking." Edgar set the shell on the windowsill beside the others. Then, for the first time in what felt like years, he sat down at the table again, not to eat, not to plan, just to be there. And listen to the silence that no longer echoed. The morning came with a stillness that felt borrowed. No gulls, no wind, Even the fog seemed unsure of itself, hovering higher than usual, like it didn't want to touch the ground. Edgar woke to the sound of nothing, and he knew before he opened his eyes. Something had shifted. He made coffee anyway, poured 1 cup, set out 4 mugs like he had for the past few days, then paused. The quiet wasn't the same as before. It wasn't absence. It was after. Outside, the shed door hung open, just slightly, not kicked or forced, just left. Edgar walked down without rushing. He already knew what he would find. The blankets were gone, the tarp folded neatly in a corner. The crates had been pushed back into place. No note, no mess, only a drawing. It was taped to the inside of the generator door, fluttering slightly in the early breeze. Crayon on cardboard, a rough rectangle meant to be the lighthouse, big and tall and glowing yellow. 4 stick figures stood in front of it, 1 tall with a square head, 1 medium with a ponytail, 2 small, both with long arms and round eyes. Above them, written in red block letters, "Thank you for the light." Edgar didn't take it down. He didn't go back inside either. Instead, he sat on the bottom step and looked out over the cliff. The sea was flat, almost silver, like it was pretending to be something softer. He stayed there for an hour, maybe 2. He didn't think about where they'd gone, didn't imagine the bus station, the road, the next shelter. That wasn't his business, that wasn't part of the deal. But he noticed in the grass near the path 3 sets of footprints leading away, 2 small, 1 larger. Clear at first, then fading as they reached the gravel, then the dirt, then vanished altogether. The same way most things did, that afternoon he walked the house like a stranger. Noticed the handprints on the side of the pantry, the faint chalk marks on the door frame, the missing mug from the rack. Lonnie must have taken it. Or maybe Leah. Good, he hoped they did. Edgar didn't eat dinner that night. He didn't light the stove. He sat at the table and watched the light dim slowly outside, slipping behind fog and horizon in equal measure. He thought he might feel hollow, but it wasn't quite that. It was more like cooling, the kind of quiet that follows heat, like breath settling after a run, like the last echo in a room where someone had laughed too hard, too long ago. Later in the tower, he turned on the beacon. Let it rotate, slow and steady, no ships on the water, no movement on the coast. But still, the light went on, because that was the deal, that was his part. He gave light to whoever might need it, even if he never saw their face, even if they never came back, even if they did and left again. And just before he climbed down the spiral stairs, he glanced out the side window and saw it. A small seashell, placed dead center on the railing. It hadn't been there this morning. Not white, like the others. This one was pink, faint, almost translucent, a goodbye that didn't ask to be returned. He left it there and walked back down into the dark. The wind didn't start as a roar. It came like a question. First a flicker in the tree, then a low, rising pressure in the air, like the moment before a wave breaks. Edgar felt it before he saw it, the way old men feel the weather in their joints. A heaviness behind his ribs, a tension in the hinges of the kitchen door. The forecast hadn't said much, just storm activity, possible gusts. But Edgar had lived on this cliff long enough to know. Some storms don't warn you in words. He climbed the tower before dusk, inspecting the glass, checking the lens, everything intact, everything aligned. But the wind howled harder as the sun dipped. The clouds turned the color of wet iron. Waves slammed the rocks below like fists without rhythm. By nightfall, the entire station moaned under strain. He stayed awake, didn't light the stove, didn't play the radio, just paced, counted the seconds between gusts, tightened the window latches, watched the anemometer needle dance past its safe range and stay there. At 2:13 a.m., the first bolt of lightning split the horizon. At 2:14, the beacon blinked. Once, then again, then stopped. He ran, boots thudding up the stairs, wind screaming through the slats. The door at the top of the spiral rattled against its frame. When he opened it, the blast knocked him back one step. Then he saw it. The support brace on the south side had snapped, a clean shear. Not rusted through, not corroded, just broken. The entire tower leaned half a degree too far west. Not much, but enough. He dropped to his knees and grabbed the emergency latches, pulled the manual override. The lens clicked, tried to spin, but the motor stuttered, the casing rattled, and then the wind hit again, a sound like a tree cracking in winter, a shudder through the stone. The top section of the beacon cracked. Not fully. Just a jagged line of surrender, the kind that always ends the same way, just not tonight. He stayed there for hours, hands on the metal, not fixing, just holding, like a man trying to slow a funeral by pressing on the coffin lid. By dawn, the storm passed, but the damage had been done. The beacon no longer turned. The southern brace hung twisted like ribbon, and the light, his light, was gone. Not shattered, not exploded, not taken in fire, just dead. He climbed down slowly, knees screaming. The house felt like a stranger now. Damp, cold, not quiet, hollow. He didn't try to fix it, didn't call for parts, didn't radio in a repair request. There was no one left to answer. The Coast Guard had automated the line years ago. And anyway, no ships had come near in months. The lighthouse had been more ritual than necessity, and now even the ritual was broken. He made tea, sat on the porch, watched the clouds thin out over the water. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the absence of motion. There had always been something to maintain. Some screw to tighten, some glass to clean. Now, there was only the weight of stillness. He looked out at the cliff edge, where the girls had once hopped across stones, where Marla had knelt to fix the vent. Nothing there now but wet grass and a single boot print. Fading, he stayed outside until dark, didn't light a lantern, didn't climb the stairs. And when night swallowed the station whole, he sat in it, without defiance, without fear. Just a man in a place without a purpose, and for the first time in years he slept, not deeply but completely, as if something had finally been taken from him that he no longer had to protect. Days passed without shape. Edgar no longer lit the tower, no longer climbed the steps. The spiral staircase gathered dust, and the broken beacon loomed like a monument to a ritual no one remembered. He moved slowly through the house like a ghost that hadn't realized it had died. Meals were simple and few. Some days he forgot lunch entirely. The tea grew cold more often than not. There was nothing to maintain, no light to tend, no visitors, not even footprints. Then, one morning, a voice crackled through the old shortwave radio. It was faint, buried under static, but he caught enough to freeze mid-step. "Small vessel, caught off West Reef, visibility near zero, claimed a light guided them in, said it wasn't the official tower. Someone lit something else." Edgar sat down, not suddenly, not shocked, just slowly. Like gravity had returned, he turned the volume up, listened again, but the message had passed. The voice drifted on to another report weather for inland counties, a livestock alert. He rewound the tape recorder, played it back, the same words. Claimed a light guided them in. A light, but not his, not the tower, something else. His mind turned over the facts like stones. The tower was down. He hadn't touched it since the storm. No backups, no battery lanterns mounted. He had checked. So what had they seen? He stood, walked to the back porch. The sky was overcast, the sea sooty flat again. Gulls hung in the air, still and watching. He scanned the shore, the shed, the cliff path. Nothing. Then he walked the trail he hadn't touched in weeks, down toward the southern bend where driftwood sometimes piled after high tide. And he saw it, not a light, but the memory of one. Charred wood, burn marks on the edge of a flat stone, a circle of rocks stacked with care. Nearby, a pile of glass shards bottles, maybe cut and placed to catch the wind, and in the middle the frame of something that looked like a lamp, not an electric one, a makeshift lantern. Edgar crouched slowly, picked up a piece of melted wax wrapped with string. It still smelled faintly of lavender. He looked out to the water, then to the path leading back toward the shed. The shell was still on the tower railing, the pink one, untouched by storm or gull or time. He closed his hand around the bit of wax. Someone had come back, not to stay, not to speak, but to light the way for someone else, and not once had they knocked. Edgar sat by the cold fire pit for a long time, fingers pressed to the rock, remembering the heat that had once lived there. He didn't feel anger, he didn't feel joy. What he felt was harder to name. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the quiet sting of being replaced and the deeper relief that it hadn't been forgotten. He stood, and for the first time in weeks he lit the stove again. The cameras had been silent since the storm, old units wired analog, long past their prime. Edgar hadn't checked the feeds in weeks, but something about the fire pit, the wax, the smooth precision of the stone circle, it tugged at him. Someone had been back, not just once, with purpose. He climbed to the equipment room, a windowless closet below the beacon chamber. The monitor flickered when he powered it up, edges ghosted with static. The date stamps were off by days, maybe weeks. Still, the tapes had kept rolling. He fast-forwarded through gray mornings, birds crossing frames, fog creeping in and out like a tide. Nothing unusual, until one timestamp blinked past his eyes and made his thumb freeze. 03:27 a.m. Night of the storm. He hit play. For a moment, nothing but black and blur, then movement. A figure appeared at the edge of frame, hunched against the wind, hair tied back, coat too large for her shoulders, in her left arm a bundle. The younger girl, asleep or too cold to walk. The older one close behind, holding something round and flickering. A jar, a flame inside. They moved fast, practiced, as if they'd done it before. The woman, Marla, though the camera didn't say her name, knelt near the cliff's bend. The older girl began placing stones in a pattern. Even on grainy footage, the care was obvious. The little one stirred in her sleep but didn't cry. Together they built the small fire pit, lit the wax, set the bottle glass around it. A makeshift lens, primitive but effective. For 3 minutes the flame held. Then the wind surged, nearly blowing it out. Marla shielded it with her coat, crouched low, hands trembling from cold or memory. He couldn't tell. The flame bent sideways but didn't die. And then they were gone, back into the dark. No message, no goodbye, just light. Edgar sat still, the buzz of the monitor humming like a breath held too long. Outside, a gull cried once and was quiet. He leaned back, eyes closed, let the silence pool around him like smoke, then stood, stretched his stiff knees, and made his way down the tower. On the porch, the wind had picked up again, and something new had appeared on the railing. A glass bottle, tall, clear, with a rolled paper inside. He hadn't noticed it earlier. Could have been dropped off that morning or last night. Could have been there all along. He unscrewed the cap. The note inside was short, folded neatly, written in a hand, too steady to be a child's. Some lights stay on longer than they should. Some go out before they're meant to. Yours still mattered. M. He reread it 3 times, then set it beside the jar on the windowsill. That evening he didn't relight the broken beacon, but he did build a new fire pit beside the old one. Collected dry driftwood, dug out his last candle stubs. He worked with slow hands and steady breath. No rush, no audience. He lit the flame just after dusk, not high, not bright, but enough. And this time, when it caught and held, Edgar didn't walk away. He sat beside it, watched it flicker against the stone, and let the light be enough. They arrived in the morning, quietly, like fog. No car, no knock, just motion on the path near the southern slope. Edgar spotted them from the porch. First the two girls, then Marla trailing behind, a small duffel over one shoulder, her coat flapping loose in the wind. They didn't wave. He didn't stand, but something inside him, some piece that had curled up since the storm unfolded. The girls were taller now, not by much, but enough to notice. Leah walked with more certainty. Lonnie carried a plastic bucket full of colored string, shells, and a hammer too big for her hand. Marla wore the same boots, scuffed, mended near the toe. They didn't ask to come inside, didn't explain why they'd returned, didn't mention the note in the bottle. They just began. Lonnie cleared the porch of driftwood. Leah tugged the rug outside and beat the dust from it. Marla headed toward the broken south brace, eyes scanning the damage like a mechanic reading a pulse. Edgar said nothing. He sipped his coffee, watched the sea, let the moment breathe. By midday, tools had appeared, some from his shed, some from Marla's pack. The wrench roll was laid out on the step like a picnic. They worked in a rhythm unspoken. Leah sorted screws by size. Lonnie held bolts while Marla replaced the lower bracket with slow, focused precision. Edgar joined them eventually. No invitation, no instructions. He simply handed Marla a socket head when she reached for it. She didn't thank him, didn't need to. Some silences are made of tension. This one wasn't. It was the kind born from people who'd stopped asking permission to belong. By late afternoon, the south brace stood again. Not factory new, but sturdy. Marla stepped back, wiped her hands on a rag, and looked at Edgar. A single nod. Not proud, just done. That night, Edgar lit the stove for dinner. Carrot stew, dry biscuits. Marla found dried rosemary in the cupboard and crushed it between her palms, sprinkling it into the pot without comment. The girls set the table without being told. No one said, "It's good to be back." No one asked, "How long will you stay?" The answer was already in the motion. After dinner, Lonnie placed a new shell on the windowsill. This one was blue, painted. A tiny dot of yellow in the center, just enough to suggest flame. The first thing they fixed was the porch step. No one brought it up. No one pointed out the loose board that had been groaning under Edgar's heel for years. Marla just crouched one morning, ran her hand along the split grain and muttered, "Soft rot." By the afternoon it was gone, replaced with a fresh plank salvaged from the driftwood pile and sanded down until the edges fit like they'd always been there. Edgar hadn't even noticed when she started. He only saw it when he stepped outside and didn't hear the usual creak. He paused, looked down, then glanced toward the yard where Lonnie was kneeling in the dirt, planting something in a tin can. He didn't ask what, didn't need to. Some things grow best when left unnamed. Later, Leah scrubbed out the old water basin beside the shed. It hadn't been used in years, just filled by rain and forgotten. She emptied it, rinsed it with warm vinegar, then set it under the downspout with the same focus Edgar had once given to the tower lens. By evening, it caught the first clean water, a bowl of reflection under the gray sky. That night, they ate fish and rice. Leah helped season it. Lonnie stirred until the pot hissed. Marla sat across from Edgar, her hands red from sanding, her sleeves rolled high. They didn't talk during the meal, just ate, passed the salt, reached across at the same time for the same ladle and paused, half laughing, but saying nothing. Afterward, the girls lined up seashells on the porch railing. One for each day, not labeled, just there. Each a different color, each a different shape. Edgar never asked what they meant. He just began counting them quietly as he walked out each morning with his coffee. 12 by the end of the second week. One was cracked. One was still damp. One had a tiny hole bored into it, as if it had been worn down by time. Marla repaired the bench under the kitchen window on a Sunday. Didn't say a word about it. Just moved the tools outside, planed the legs smooth, reinforced the frame with an iron bracket that she'd salvaged from the broken generator. Edgar brought her a cup of tea and set it on the step. She nodded without looking. That was enough. One morning, Lonnie stood beside Edgar while he sanded a window frame. She didn't say anything, just stood there holding a brush. Eventually, he handed it to her. She dipped it in paint and worked beside him in total silence for 45 minutes. Her brush strokes were uneven, but she didn't stop, and he didn't correct her. That afternoon, the wind picked up, harder than usual. Marla and Edgar both moved without speaking, closing shutters, tying down buckets, bracing the southern vent. The storm didn't come, but they were ready anyway. At dusk, Edgar found a shell tucked into the fold of his work gloves. It was gray, smooth, with 3 lines scratched across its surface. A child's attempt at a lighthouse. He left it on the mantel. Didn't say thank you. Didn't ask which girl had made it. It didn't matter. It had appeared, that was enough. That night, he sat alone outside for a while, the repaired porch steps solid beneath him. Inside, he could hear Marla rinsing dishes. The girls were humming something tuneless. It filled the gaps in the air like wind under an old sail. He looked at the tower. Still dark, still broken, but not empty. And for the first time in a very long time, Edgar didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like he was building something, even if he didn't know what. The new table wasn't much to look at. Rough cedar, uneven stain, legs slightly crooked if you stared too long. Marla had salvaged the top from an old dock board they found washed ashore. Edgar had done most of the sanding. Leah painted one corner with pale blue swirls. Lonnie pressed a wet leaf onto the surface and left a faint green imprint that nobody tried to wipe off. It didn't match the chairs. It didn't sit evenly on the old stone floor. But it felt earned. That evening, they sat around it for the first time. No one said anything special. There were no toasts, no declarations. But the bowls were full, the light was soft, and no one sat with their coats still on. Lonnie asked for more rice. Leah passed the water jug without being asked. Marla ate slowly, eyes half lowered, her shoulders not hunched for once. Edgar chewed in rhythm with the wind outside, steady, unhurried. The only sound was spoons, breath, the quiet clink of ceramic. After the meal, Leah brought out a folded piece of paper, set it in the center of the table like an offering. A drawing. The new table, the lighthouse, 4 figures. Same as before, but different now. Closer together. Less space between their stick figure hands. Edgar didn't comment, but he didn't fold it away either. He left it there. Let it stay. Marla rose first to do the dishes. Edgar started to follow, but she waved him off with a flick of her wrist. Not sharp, not cold, just clear. Sit. He sat. Lonnie climbed into the chair beside him with her toy fish and began humming. Leah wiped the table with slow, circular strokes. It smelled like rosemary and salt and the faint sweetness of ash from the morning's fire. No one spoke about the table. No one mentioned the shift, but it had happened. Something had landed. Not loudly, just enough. Later that night, Edgar stood on the porch. The moon was low. The breeze had changed direction again. He looked back through the kitchen window. Marla was stacking dry bowls. Leah had fallen asleep in the armchair. Lonnie was wrapping string around the base of a shell. He let out a slow breath. Not relief, not joy. Just quiet recognition. This wasn't rescue, this wasn't resolution. But it was shelter. and sometimes that was more honest than love. He turned back toward the sea, and for the first time since the tower fell, he whispered not to be heard, but to remember what it felt like. Good night. The clock had stopped ticking the year after his daughter left. It wasn't a grand thing, just a pocket watch, silver case, numbers worn soft from time and thumb. He kept it in a drawer, not because it was broken, but because he couldn't stand the sound of it working while nothing else moved. Marla had found it 3 days ago, buried under coils of twine and dull screwdrivers. She hadn't said anything, just set it beside her tea, let it sit in the sunlight. That evening, Edgar opened it up. The spring hadn't snapped. The gear had simply slipped. By moonlight, he adjusted the tiny teeth, polished the face, set the time, nothing symbolic, just 6:42 p.m., and closed it with a soft snap. Now it ticked again. He wrapped it in a cloth, walked across the porch, found Marla sitting on the bench they'd rebuilt together, coat draped over her knees, hair braided loosely over one shoulder. She didn't look up. He held out the cloth. She took it, unwrapped it slowly. The ticking began to fill the space between them. Steady, present. Marla turned it over in her hands, ran a thumb across the back. No words, no thank you, just a long exhale. And that was enough. But Edgar wasn't done. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small carving knife, dull from years of disuse, but sharp enough for what he intended, walked to the far edge of the railing overlooking the sea, and began to carve. The girls were inside, playing some quiet guessing game with stones and whispers. Marla remained seated. She didn't ask what he was doing, but her gaze followed the rhythm of his hands. The wood gave reluctantly. Rough grain, salt-worn. He worked slowly, not out of frailty, but out of care, as if choosing the right pressure meant choosing the right memory. 10 minutes, then 20. The wind stirred but didn't interrupt. Finally, he stepped back, let the light catch the fresh lines. They weren't neat, weren't artistic, just true. We stayed, even when we didn't know why. Beneath it, just initials. M-L-L-E. Marla rose, came beside him, ran her fingers across the groove, didn't speak, didn't cry. But she smiled, not with her mouth, not quite, with her eyes, with the way her shoulders dropped, just slightly. Like a backpack she'd carried too long had finally slid to the floor. Edgar didn't move. They stood like that for a while, side by side, facing the sea, letting the carving settle into the wood and into memory. Behind them, the girls laughed, a burst of joy, sudden and echoing. Not loud enough to startle, just enough to remind them life had come back, not all at once, not dramatically, but real. And that night, before turning in, Edgar passed the carving again in the dark, ran his fingers along the words, felt the edges, noticed how the salt air had already begun to settle into the cut. He didn't mind. Some words need weather to prove they were meant to stay. The beacon never worked again. Edgar had accepted that. The lens was cracked beyond repair, the motor warped, the supply line long abandoned by the people who once cared. The tower stood like an old soldier, proud but done. So he lit smaller fires, a lantern on the porch, a low flame by the cliff, sometimes a line of candles near the southern bend protected by glass jars and driftwood. He didn't write reports, didn't log them, didn't even face them seaward anymore. The light was no longer for ships. It was for the house, the path, the bench where someone might sit with a cup of tea and no questions. One evening, as the wind came low and steady from the east, Edgar was adjusting a wick on the new porch lamp when Leah padded out in her socks, hands tucked in her sleeves. She stood beside him without speaking, watching the tiny flame flicker. Then, without turning, "What if no one sees it?" He paused, held still, the kind of stillness only people who've been lonely a long time can hold. Then he said simply, "Then we still know it's there." She was quiet then. "But it's supposed to help people, right?" He nodded. "It does." She squinted toward the dark horizon. Nothing but sky, sea, and the hum of coming night. "Even if no one's out there?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw it. Not just curiosity, but something deeper. A child asking about more than the lamp. A question older than she knew how to name. He crouched beside her, pointed to the flame. "Some lights are for guiding others. Some just remind us we're not lost." Leah considered that, then smiled faintly. "So it's for us too. Especially us." She nodded, then handed him a seashell, painted orange, with a thin stripe of yellow down the center. He placed it beside the others on the rail. Now there were 18, each different, each left without needing attention. That night, they lit 3 lanterns, one by the path, one on the kitchen sill, one in the old birdhouse Lonnie had turned into a signal station with string and buttons. None of them faced the sea, but that didn't mean they didn't shine. Spring came late that year. The fog held longer. The mornings stayed gray and the wind still carried salt sharp enough to sting. But beneath the porch, between 2 stones where rainwater gathered, something had taken root, a sprout, tiny, green, too early maybe, but stubborn. Edgar didn't touch it. He just marked the spot with a small ring of shells. 3 days later, Marla found him in the shed sanding an old wooden board. He didn't say what it was for. She didn't ask. But by evening, the board had become a sign. He watched her carve the letters with quiet care, then sand them smooth, then oil them. Just before dusk, she climbed onto the stepladder and nailed the board above the doorframe where the government plaque had once hung. It read, "The Lighthouse." Not lighthouse. Not as a noun, but as a sentence, an intention. Edgar stood beside her, let the meaning settle, then walked down the slope with a trowel in one hand and a cloth bundle in the other. Behind the broken southern brace, where the wind had once knocked the tower askew, he dug. Not deep, just enough for a sapling. It wasn't much, thin, bendable, no more than his forearm in height. The kind of tree most wouldn't bet on, but he pressed the soil in around it gently, watered it from a rusted kettle, and stepped back. From the porch, Lonnie called out, "What kind is it?" He looked up, met her eyes. "Doesn't matter," he said. "If it stays, we'll find out." That night they lit a single lamp, not for show, just to remind the dark that someone was home. As they cleared the table, Leah pointed to the windowsill. "There's only 1 shell left," she whispered. Marla smiled faintly. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we start a new row." Just before bed, Edgar returned to the young tree, set a smooth white stone at its base. On it, a single word etched by hand, "Enough."